Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes to give folks some time to join the platform. All right, and I see people are joining, so we'll get things started, and hopefully people who are straggling in will kind of catch up. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our conversation on how to thoughtfully measure engineering productivity beyond lines of code. My name is Kelly Fitzpatrick. I am a senior analyst at RedMonk, the developer-focused industry analyst firm, and I am delighted to serve as your host and your moderator today. Today's conversation was organized by Retool and was partly inspired by their recent State of Engineering Time report, in which they surveyed over 600 engineers. The report has a lot of really interesting and I think useful information around areas that I think affect engineering productivity, like amount of time waiting for a code review for a single pull request, and also amount of time trying to find out who owns a certain piece of code. If you haven't checked it out, I suggest you do. I definitely found it worth my time, which I think is valuable. In today's hour-ish long session, we won't be covering the report findings specifically, but we will be talking about engineering productivity more broadly. And to me, this is a very interesting and timely topic. So here at RedMonk, we talk to a lot of different companies, a lot of different developers. We've heard a lot about developer productivity, developer velocity, developer efficiency. And it's also something that came up a lot in my former life when I was an individual contributor on an engineering team. And I think I still have nightmares about burn down charts from back in the day. I suspect that many of you in the audience also have the kind of thoughts and questions about this topic. We will be taking questions at the end. We'll save about 15 minutes at the end to try to answer your questions, as many of them as we can. So if you do have a question, please drop it in the questions section of the Livestorm platform, which is separate from the chat. So if you found the chat, you can probably find the question section and just drop your questions in there and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Now, without further ado, we have an excellent group of experts with us here today to talk about engineering productivity, and we're going to kick things off with a round of introductions. I'm going to ask my speakers to introduce themselves, to talk a little bit about where they are and kind of how big their current team is, and maybe talk about any previous gigs that might inform their view of tech or engineering productivity. And Uma, we'll start with you.
Hi, very happy to be here. This is something I care deeply about. I lead engineering at a startup called Render, which is a modern cloud for developers. And one of our sort of key things that we're hoping to provide on our platform is enable developer productivity by abstracting away the complexity of the platform. My team is currently 32 engineers. The entire company is 43. Prior to Render, I led an internal infrastructure team at Stripe, which was much larger, and we were adjacent to a dev prod org, so parts of surveys and similar.
Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Nora, on to you.
Thanks, Kelly. Super happy to be here too. This is also one of my favorite topics. I've spent most of my career in developer productivity, started the team for developer productivity at Jet, which got acquired by Walmart, and then also did some work around developer productivity, chaos engineering, and incident analysis at Slack and Netflix, and then led to me founding my own company focused on helping organizations be more productive and learn more from their incidents. And that's called Jeli.io. And yeah, really excited to be here.
And we're excited to have you as well. And last but not least, Snir.
Awesome. Thank you. Nice to meet you, everybody, and thanks for joining. I'm head of engineering at Retool. Been very close to engineering my entire career. Have sort of worked the gamut of large to small companies. Have been a founder. Prior to my time at Retool, I was director of engineering at Lyft. Org there was about 80 folks. And so this is near and dear, similarly to my heart, unsurprisingly, on the basis of it's what I spend my time doing, what I've been spending my time doing for the last several years, multi-decade.
Great. Well, so I think everyone is excited about this topic today, but I feel like engineering productivity, it's something where we might all think that we mean the same thing when we say it, but we might think about it in very different ways. So I think to kick things off, I think it's worth considering what we mean when we say engineering productivity. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers to kind of tell us how you define engineering productivity. And Nora, why don't you lead us off on this one?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's defined in a number of different ways by a number of different orgs. I define engineering productivity if folks are learning and productive and happy and productive in a way that they're feeling challenged, they're feeling like they're accomplished and getting stuff done. And as leaders, we have the ability to set the tone for that. The stuff that you reward and prioritize ends up becoming your culture, and it ends up becoming how your engineers define productivity too. And so I think that's why it's different across a number of different orgs. Ultimately, as leaders, we're carrying that people are feeling happy and motivated, but that they're also getting stuff done. And when people are happy and motivated, they do get stuff done. It just naturally sort of happens, and that trust can envelop. So I define it as a learning environment. And yeah, I'll get more into that later in the panel.
Yeah, and I love how you're like, you've already tied engineering productivity to happiness, which I think is, everyone's nodding their head. So I'm like, oh my goodness. I feel like we might have similar views on this as well. Snir, how about you? How would you define engineering productivity?
Yeah, I'd say multi-parted. Firstly, engagement, which I think goes very well hand in hand with that sort of happiness. And that can come in a lot of different facets. Obviously, there's sort of engagement with code, fundamental engagement with technology, but also engagement with customers, with the product, which leads me to sort of the primary thing that I really care about, which is impact. And that's predominantly through artifact creation, is my general opinion, right? We're here to build product. I think for the most part, at least both in my experience and my belief system, engineering has aspects of solving puzzles, but it's not about solving puzzles. It's about shipping impact and really whatever your customer base is, consumer, enterprise, delivering that value proposition to them. And so that's the thing that I really want to make sure that we're maximizing. And I think engagement is the conduit to doing that. That's what productivity means to me.
Engagement is another good word, I think, as well. We're getting really good related words to productivity, I think. Uma, what are your thoughts on defining engineering productivity?
I think strong +1 to both what Nora and Snir just said. In addition, I like to think of it as sort of all the things that contribute to keeping engineers in a state of flow. So everything that allows them to stay in that state of flow, and anything that detracts from that is sort of the opposite of it. We've known for like many years now that context switching is the most important kind of like, anti-pattern. And the thing that bothers engineers the most is when they have to context switch between many different things. I think the report actually goes to that, shows that a lot as well. So, and to Snir's point, that flow is really important to the pace of shipping. And that's really, and the impact. So engineering productivity is, in my view, everything that allows engineers to stay in flow and keep shipping and anything and do the things that they want to do and why they're in the org.
Yeah, and flow is also, that's another word that I've heard, I'm going to say in the past 2 years, a lot more than I have like in my previous conversations that I've had with folks, like keeping people in it, and hearing like that really fits to my memories of back when I actually was working on a product. And I'm kind of like, yes, like one question will like take 20 minutes out of my day, even though it's only like a 2-minute question. Because then I have to go get a cup of coffee as well, or a snack or something, or you get pulled into another kind of conversation. So we kind of have like these baseline understanding of what we're saying, at least when we say engineering productivity. And now I kind of want to shift to thinking about when we're attempting to measure engineering productivity, what is the goal in these measurements? is this related to engineering happiness, as like Nora has already kind of made that tie? And what audiences do the attempts to measure engineering productivity serve? And Snir, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. I would go back to the point about impact, which is that's really the thing that I want to have any engineering function and really any sort of broader EPD, end product and design function, maximize, which is how much value we're creating and sort of the net output and net outcome of the work. And that's really what productivity should ultimately lead to, is that dimension of impact. And so when we are measuring it, I think to Uma's point, which is a very good one in terms of maximizing flow, that is very much so one dimension, right? It's starting to try and understand what systemically about an ecosystem, whether it's sort of a particular company or a subset of it, a particular team, what obstacles are they introducing or are they encountering to the throughput, to the productivity that ultimately ends up in impact. And so that's really the end goal, right? Is how much value we're creating, and everything that we are doing in the analysis stage of productivity is really trying to identify what are the potholes, what are the sort of like hurdles in maximizing flow and in understanding what makes an engineer's life difficult. So that would be my answer, which is like every other input metric is really all about driving and maximizing impact.
Yeah, Uma, Nora, any thoughts on that or any responses?
I can add more. Again, agree with what Snir says. What I have used these metrics for, and I think what they should be used for, is honestly trying to identify areas to invest in. So kind of like a quick example that actually the survey also covered is, interviews are a source of interrupts and people find them toilsome. So we actually ran into this at my startup, at many other places. So the question is, how do you make that less frictionful for engineers, and how do you make the interview process itself more efficient? So I think the right output should be identifying investments that you can then make collectively as an organization to minimize interrupts and minimize context switches, so engineers are kept in the flow as much as possible. Other things could be like investing in tools, like the kind of tools that Nora's building, things like that.
Yeah, and I believe the stat from the survey was something like 30% want to spend less time doing interviewing and hiring, which is kind of hard because most people are still at the point where they're trying to hire because we need more team members to use all these different things. But Nora, you wanted to jump in on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think a really interesting theme throughout the entire report that I saw was around collaboration, and like interviews kind of relate to that because you do want these engineers in these interviews because they're going to have to collaborate with these people later on. So it is important to do that and to make time for it. I think some of the hardest parts is studying what happens, how success happens, like not just retroing incidents, but retroing your successes too, and understanding how they unfolded, understanding how your incidents unfolded, because when you do that, you can know how and when to recreate it, but it takes a lot of time to do that. But what ends up happening is there's a psychologist, Amy Edmondson, and she talks about how psychological safety relates to performance standards, which kind of relates to the happiness thing you're talking about. And so she has psychological safety on the y-axis and performance standards on the x-axis. And so it's, low performance standards, low psychological safety leads to what she calls an apathy zone. High psychological safety but low performance standards leads to a comfort zone, which is where nothing is getting done. So people are happy, but they're not really productive. And then high performance standards and high psychological safety leads to what she calls a learning zone. So people collaborate and learn in the open in the service of high performance work and getting complex and innovative work done. And I think that's the thing we all need to strive for. But a lot of times orgs get in the trap of over indexing on one versus the other, like high performance standards and low psychological safety ends up in an anxiety zone where people are very nervous about getting things done. They're getting things done, but they're burning out too. And so, yeah, it ends up having all the opposite effects.
And psychological safety, I love this term. And back when I was working on an engineering team, I had never heard of this term. I only learned about it when I took some time to go teach computer science majors at Georgia Tech. And one of the things we did is we had teams do this kind of like, we had our students working in these student teams, and we had them do like a kind of survey that was evaluating like their team's performance and their team members' performance, but also like talking about psychological safety. And like, now I have to go learn what this is because I have to teach about it, which is amazing. And it just strikes me as something that it is an underutilized concept in our industry when we're talking about things like team happiness and engineering productivity and all of these other types of things. But yeah, and there is a question in the chat about getting the psychologist's name. So Nora, maybe you could drop that in there when you get a chance, because I did not write that down either. I was too busy just listening to you. So one thing that we talked about a little bit at the very kind of beginning when we were doing introductions was this idea of kind of team size. And I'm wondering, like, at what level does it make sense to kind of consider measuring productivity for whatever definition that you're using? Like, is it an individual metric? Is it something we do with small teams or larger organizational units? And how might the metrics or methods change depending on the size? And Uma, I think for this one, we'll start with you.
Yeah, this is a great question. It's something I actually had to think about. I think you absolutely want to be at least thinking about it at every size. I think the methodology is what changes. So, as an example, at like a 10-person engineering team, which is what my team was when I joined Render, you actually take the more ad hoc approach of just talking to everyone on the team, or at that point, typically teams have a lot more open flow of information. So they'll actually tell you, and you just have to kind of listen. So they'll tell you like, hey, interviews or incidents or like, out of band requests are the things that are taking the most of my time and preventing me from kind of working on my the main thing that I'm supposed to be doing. And then as your organization scales, then you sort of want to change tactics and invest in some sort of broader tooling. An example would be like, quarterly or biannual developer surveys. So larger orgs tend to do that. And typically you also want to wait for a while to do like a broad survey because you need enough data points to get that information. But you can do smaller, lighter weight surveys like in the in-between. So you sort of have to go from like conversations to lighter weight surveys to maybe broader surveys of the entire organization as you get larger. And then I think a key thing I will throw in there that it's important to also actually take action on the things that you're asking people about. The worst sort of failure mode is if you ask people what's going wrong and then don't do anything as a follow-up. That's super important in my opinion.
Yeah, it's like we would like you to spend some of your valuable time on this survey, and then we will do nothing about it. Is probably not the best way to
Research
go.
has shown that's actually worse than even not doing the survey to begin with.
Right.
That's
It lessens trust too.
Yeah.
Nora, Snir, any thoughts on this?
I agree with Uma in that you can start doing it at any size. And as a leader, you have to pop your head up as you're hitting certain milestones with size and really think about if the approach you're taking is working. I think as leaders, we really want to look at how people are communicating together and working together. And that kind of starts with how people are talking to each other. What is our culture in Slack? What is our culture over Zoom? Who do people naturally bring into certain conversations? That's all qualitative stuff that we can get and surface without necessarily needing to have someone fill out a survey. I think it is useful to do those kinds of qualitative things and enroll people in the conversation. And I think those survey questions can be made a lot better by leaders doing a pass at some of that first and studying some of that on their own.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think that the survey point is 100% cogent. There's also other forms of aggregations that I think are really interesting, right? How interrupt driven are people's calendars in aggregate? And I think that the thing that I will drumbeat is aggregation, because I think to the point of like, should it be done at the individual level? I strongly disagree with it and can sort of expound on that if helpful. But I think as long as you can do some sort of roll up, which I think was Uma's point as well about sort of having enough data points, looking at, there's so many other data points that can be gleaned. Again, the calendar is an interesting one. Slack is a really interesting one in terms of like the types of messages and sort of whether it's private, public, inbound, outbound. Again, so many metric points to consider. And I think my perspective is that none of those metrics in isolation tell a narrative, right? All of those metrics, especially change over time of those metrics, however, can lead to really, really good subsequent follow-on investigation. So if you see that, your org went from, hey, for the most part, pretty sort of defragmented schedules, a lot of contiguous time, to, hey, all of a sudden you have this elbow in the curve. A lot of people have these sort of like very small blocks. That's the thing that should inspire subsequent investigation and sort of follow-up discovery.
Yeah, and I love this idea of thinking of whatever method you're doing, whether it's like interviews or surveys, as almost iterative in and of itself, because it's kind of like the first version that you do is not necessarily going to be what you keep doing, because you're going to find ways to make it better and more useful, productive, and worth your time. I think. And so kind of thinking about where this idea of engineering productivity fits into a larger org structure. And I think this is where like an organization side is going to really, the answer is going to vary very much based on organization side. To what extent does your company structure and maybe project design affect your engineering team or teams kind of work in productivity? And how much are you able to influence that? And I think, Nora, we're going to start with you, because I feel like you may have a lot of influence on your overall organization.
Yeah, I mean, I am in a small organization today, and I'm the CEO of it. So just, yeah, like the influence for sure. But being in larger organizations and being in developer productivity roles, like it is interesting to me now comparing the influence and the communication and seeing it versus looking at that at like a Slack or a Netflix or a Walmart. It is much, much different, and different approaches should be taken. I think Snir is absolutely right in that not looking at one single thing is sufficient. And you're actually, if you are looking at one single thing or honing in on a single metric, you're actually going to end up hindering productivity and probably making things worse. So it's really important to aggregate and get all these signals. It's actually a lot of what inspired me to start Jeli. I felt like I was trying to get signals from Slack, from PagerDuty, from like understanding what teams people were on, from understanding like where people sat in the world. And it was a lot of data to deal with. And I felt like I had sticky notes all over my desk. So our product actually focuses on aggregating all those things so you can get these better signals easier and make better decisions about your productivity and collaboration. But I think, orgs, especially in the tech industry, tend to get caught up in these cycles about how work should be done. And they don't take time to study how work actually is done. And so they have this idea in their head, like maybe a project didn't get delivered on time, or maybe something happened, and they have this idea as to why. And then they kind of over-index on doing the opposite thing in the future, and it hurts. And in larger organizations, I think what happens is promotion ladders end up getting introduced. People are starting to look at what their career development in that work looks like, and they will base their day-to-day work kind of on how you as a leader structure this development, what is rewarded, what is accepted, what is considered successful. And so if you as a leader are celebrating learning and learning in the open and collaborating and learning from mistakes in a safe way and learning from successes in a safe way and actually giving people time to do that, people are going to do that. And it's going to encourage trust between leaders and engineers. And it's also going to encourage trust between engineers and other departments within each other. So yeah, I think it's a big part of studying, work as imagined versus work as done, and actually studying the delta between how you think your org is working versus how it's actually working.
And I love the kind of the point that, once you tell people what you're measuring them on, if they're not good and worthy things, like suddenly they become something that you can gamify, and probably not the best ways at all. Whereas I love this focus on something like education, because it's like you can try to game that, but you're probably going to get something good out of it, even if you're just gaming it.
And just to add on that too, I mean, I was at an org before, and this was a real story. There was a promotion thing that was introduced, and there were promotion cycles on the exact same time every quarter. And people would have to come up with these really large promotion packets in order to get their employees promoted. And the org got so big that leadership would go through those packets really quickly. Like they would scan for metrics. And so what ended up happening is a bunch of people started submitting code at the same time a week before promotion packets were due, because they were trying to adhere to the OKRs they had set out for themselves because they wanted to get promoted. But then all that code being shipped ended up leading to also a bunch of incidents during that time. And so it was actually really horrible for the business, like where they were trying to improve productivity, they actually ended up hurting themselves. So again, like kind of how incentives relate to productivity too.
Yeah. And I love that excuse of course I broke the build. I was trying to get my promotion stuff in. Like, oh my goodness.
I'd like to
it actually came up in an incident review. Someone said that. Like, go ahead, Uma.
I was going to say, I think there's a really important point you're making there, Nora, around something that we kind of touched on, but maybe didn't explicitly call out, is what should engineering productivity metrics not be used for? So I think that's really important. So in my view, they should be used for learning about the org, but also investments that the organization can make or changes that the organization can make. They should explicitly not be used for individual performance. And that goes back to the point that Snir made about aggregation versus like individual productivity. And I think the example that Nora gave really kind of hits the nail on the head as to the trap you can fall into if you use the metrics to grade individuals versus like, you can like maybe at least evaluate the organization or like make changes, but what you shouldn't be doing is going to an individual level and saying X lines of code required for promotion or Y projects required for this. And I think that's a really important thing to call out.
Yeah, very much so. So I'm interested in hearing like how much influence the rest of y'all have on the kind of engineering productivity at your org. Uma, what is going on at Render?
So we're very small, as I said. So we're still at the stage where we're just starting to talk about actually doing a survey-driven approach. Until now, it has been very much a kind of conversational, where people either surface things where they get blocked, or I or other leaders look at like, through individual chats, talk to people and figure out like, essentially happiness and sort of like, kind of interrupt driven work. So currently a few different things that I look at personally are, we actually focus a lot on incidents, but again, that's more from a quality of the product and how many interrupts are engineers getting pulled into perspective. We've already sort of like done a little bit of massaging on the interview front, but that's like a ongoing process. But those were like interviews and incidents were our top level interrupts. So we focused on those, and now we're getting to the point of actually starting to develop our first kind of lightweight survey of the team, and then plan to do investments like, okay, which parts do you fix in the tools to make them better?
Yeah, and oh, go ahead, Snir.
I was just gonna hop in as well, which is to say, to take it in a slightly different direction. I think one way of sort of establishing what it means is sort of through culture and values as well, in the sense of like, what is engineering, right? Is engineering strictly about ingesting a PRD and outputting code? I don't believe so, right? That's not how we operate at Retool. Is engineering about being thoughtful about sort of your customer segment, engaging with customers, engaging on the product dimension? Absolutely. That's sort of another dimension of what productivity can become, especially as you start to zoom out away from just strictly shipping code, which is, there's shipping any arbitrary piece of code. They're shipping the right code, which really helps affect the business and goes back to that impact point. So that's certainly one way in which I think we all of us likely, and certainly here at Retool, like, we sort of redefine what it means to be productive is by defining what exactly engineering is. And the point that I was going to make, and to tack onto that, is there's a lot of failure modes. I think Nora was citing several, which I myself have also seen. Another one is when people start to treat engineers and human beings as CPU. Oh, I need 2 weeks of engineering time. I'm going to go shuffle this person from A to B, right? And you start to really commoditize what engineering means and distill it down to like a unit of productivity, which never sits well with me because it doesn't ever track that well, right? You go back to sort of productivity months and sort of how they scale or don't scale. And so I think that's another dimension, again, through which at least I see resisting that temptation or sort of explicitly making it clear that that's not how we think of engineering. That's not how we think of engineers as another dimension.
And I love that we're getting into the like beyond what is engineering productivity to what is engineering, because I think that's something that we do tend to assume we all mean the same thing when we say engineering. But what I've learned is that especially going from a place where I was working on like one team to where I talked to like people from so many different organizations, is what engineers and developers are expected to do on any given day in any given place varies so much. And with the kind of movements that we're hearing of everything, say like shifting left, like the stuff that they're asked to do is just increasing like kind of every day. So figuring out how to think about it in terms of productivity means is like, it's never a static thing. So another question, this can be a very short one. Dashboards, yes or no? Snir, how about you lead us off on this one? I feel like you have thoughts.
I have a lot of thoughts. You make me distill it down to a single word.
You can answer with more than one word.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think dashboards, no, in part because of a lot of what's been said here, which is that as soon as you codify something into a dashboard, you encourage some nefarious secondary effects, right? So people start gamifying. I have this hilarious example from my past where, if you look at it through a number of commits, number of PRs or lines of code or days active in GitHub, I remember there was somebody who I worked with who had 480 straight days of commits in Git. And when you clicked in, some of those were readmes on the weekend where one character was being changed just to sort of prove the point, right? And so for me, like in part because of the gamification point that I believe it was Nora mentioned earlier, I'm a no on dashboards. That being said, I go back to the thing from earlier, which is that I think aggregations are very insightful. And so if you look at contiguous blocks and hours within a day normalized per engineer, that's insightful. If you look at how incidents are distributed amongst your team, that can be insightful. If you look at time to hire, that can be insightful. And so there are many dimensions, right? If you look at time spent in docs, in comments, right, that can be insightful. There's so many metrics, I suppose you could qualify them as, but aggregating them into a dashboard is a mistake. Instead, having a pulse on them, having managers have a pulse on them, having the team have a pulse on them, that can be really informative.
Yeah, very much so. Any thoughts on this, Uma, or your yes or no answer, Uma?
I think I kind of agree with what Snir says. And so my answer is like, it depends. I think it sort of goes back to my point. What are you using the dashboards for? So if you're using them as a broader sort of like temperature check on sort of like reliability, like we have many incidents here, versus are you going to go down and drill into like, why did this particular incident happen? Who was to blame, etc. So you can use them in the aggregation to sort of find hotspots, or like in interviews to find like, close rates, or where are people dropping off in the candidate pool or similar, but you can't use them at individual data point level. And what you do is also important. Like the conclusions you draw from the dashboards are important, and you have to be very careful with those.
The dashboards do not speak for, like, they do not just speak.
They are one view into the underlying data, and kind of can be the jump off point to then go investigate more, right? Like dig into that area, gather more information and learn more, but they can't be used to make conclusions by themselves.
I can't disagree with that. Nora, what say you? Dashboards? Yes
yeah,
or no?
I mean, I'm on the same page. If you over-index on dashboards like that, you are going to end up with not great results. And I'm looking at Robert's question in the chat to hear alternate suggestions to measure individual productivity or engineering productivity. And I think, as humans, we want this. We crave these like hard numbers and these hard metrics because it feels emotionally good. Like it feels almost like we're accomplishing something if we're able to make those numbers move, or if we're able to make those metrics move. But a lot of the time it is this false sense of hope. And so having this like false sense of hope actually, again, ends up hurting us in the end. But I do think there are things you can measure. And I really liked Snir's comments about looking at Google Doc comments and Google Doc views. Like I actually really encourage orgs to look at how many people are viewing their post-incident documents, how many people are voluntarily attending those meetings, because that is a really good signal for you as a leader to see how well people are collaborating. If folks don't want to have those or are kind of like sitting at their desk and not thinking they're productive, especially in a remote environment, which is, I know, something we're going to get into later, that is a really not great signal as an engineering leader. And as your org grows, like you need more of this collaboration. I worked at one org that really used to celebrate these individual heroes that came into incidents, and they would get promoted all the time. And I remember there was this one guy I worked with that would just show up in every single incident that we had. He was always there first, even when he wasn't on call, which I thought was fascinating. And I learned later he had a different threshold on all of his alerts than the rest of the company had on their alerts. And it was because like we were rewarding this like hero syndrome within our engineers, and that's not great for us. You know, I think we should be rewarding teaching and disseminating expertise and understanding expertise. Like one thing Jeli actually helps highlight is seeing how many people that you had to bring into an incident that weren't on call, because that kind of tells you about where expertise lies in your organization. And if you're able to disseminate that and plan for that, it allows for non-context switching work all the time. It allows you to understand where your people bottlenecks are as well. And like spreading those out will improve productivity.
Yeah, and I'm a +1 on the look into your Google Docs and your internal documentation. I don't know if any of you saw, but the end of last year, the Accelerate State of DevOps report came out, and the first time they actually measured the role of like internal documentation, not like external product documentation, in kind of like team performance. And there was a relationship between teams that had great internal documentation and whether they fit into that kind of like higher elite performing kind of thing. So like documentation is one of those things you could absolutely it makes everybody more productive, and it helps everybody communicate and collaborate, but it's often one of the things that is not high on the list of things that get you promoted, which maybe that needs to change.
I think maybe I'll throw out another one, which is also sort of maybe relevant to the kind of conversation happening in chat. Is I think something I've also seen that works at organizations of all levels is time it takes to onboard a new engineer onto the team. So going from being absolutely new to the team to being able to push a simple change to being able to ship a full feature to, I think for me, my current broader, you're considered fully ramped up is when you're able to be on call. So if you can start measuring all of those, and this is something that actually works for all organizational sizes. And this also gets into the fundamental thing, which is why does your organization exist? And it's primarily, to Snir's point, to deliver impact and to like ship something. So that's like a good sort of metric to be looking at, like how much time does it take for a new engineer to ship something small, meaningful, large, and in that order.
I always want to see like the time.
Yes.
Like the time for a new engineer to break the build, like when does that happen? Because it's going to happen. But how and that maybe goes to the kind of psychological safety question of, are you in a place where you feel that you can make those mistakes without having to go and hide for a year, like a year or two.
And I think break and then recover is the there's always like through the ship and debug, break and recover. There's always like two pieces to all of these.
Nora, you had something to say as well.
No, I was just kind of +1ing that. Like I think allowing people to make those mistakes from a people perspective, yes, but like how are you mitigating the blast radius in your technical system too, to make sure that they are able to do that quickly? And like I love Uma's answer about how quickly can they get on call and in a comfortable way, like and that's a huge signal as well.
Yeah, and then Snir, did you have something to say as well?
Yeah, I was actually piggybacking, now that Nora said it, a +1 there, which is, I think psychological safety is sort of the ability to make mistakes and feel okay in that. But there's sort of a precursor to that, which is, does the system protect you? Yeah. Do you have sort of systemic frameworks and checks and balances along the way that actually prevent you from making those mistakes in the first place? And so that can come in all sorts of forms. The most basic being unit tests, let's say. But there's a lot more shadow frameworks for evaluating how code is in production, giving people sort of a great feature flag framework. There's so many ways in which you can really elevate the deploy process through which code makes its way to production. And in doing so, you give engineers mechanisms that basically preempt psychological safety, because you may have failed, but the failure was constrained and it was safe failure, right? And so failing open is a great way to be. And does the system allow for that? So that's sort of the other dimension that I was going to point out, but also very much agree with what Norris just said there.
Yeah, and I feel like we could spend the rest of the time just piggybacking off that one question. But there's one question I want to absolutely make sure we get to, because we've been kind of touching on it in some of the other topics that we have been considering today, and that is this idea of communication and collaboration. So when you're thinking of communication and collaboration, and even some of the challenges that have arisen as we all kind of moved to remote work and maybe back from remote work because of the COVID pandemic, how important are communication and collaboration norms and processes for your teams, especially when you're thinking about teams working together in this kind of efficient way? And Uma, we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, this is, I'm really glad to answer this because this is something I care deeply about. One of the kind of models or frameworks I use for human communication is also related to distributed systems, or like when you're kind of like building a distributed system or evaluating one, how much sort of like how are all the different nodes connecting with each other in an efficient way, versus are you requiring everyone to talk to everyone else for everything. And then also like the different modes, like what's like a lossy mode of communication versus where do you need high fidelity, and where do you need synchronous communication versus where is async okay. And I kind of like to take those sort of concepts that are well understood in distributed systems and then kind of apply them back to teams. And something I like to think about is you actually need to sort of like be very proactive about communication norms relatively early. And you need to kind of even in the most well-meaning and psychologically safe environment, unless you have guidelines, and these can be like as simple as all meetings should have an agenda, all meetings should kind of be like notes should be taken after all meeting, etc., etc. The person calling the meeting should have an agenda. Don't have a meeting unless you really need it, or meeting free days or stuff like that. So I think that's very clearly the leader of the organization's role to kind of help with knowing what the rest of the people need in a particular scenario. Maybe you need a different set of norms at 10 people versus 40, 200 to 1,000, and sort of continuously iterating on those is really important. Something we've started experimenting with was we've kind of developed an initial first version of communication norms at Render as to how we want to communicate. So as an example, one of the reasons we actually started with why is it important to us to have communication norms, and the values were we value transparency and we value good decision making, and that's why we want good communication. It's not and one of our core values is also collaboration and continuous learning. So communication is a prerequisite for those versus communication for the sake of communication. And that's sort of how I think of the problem.
Yeah, communication as just another like stat or metric that you can game if that was the end all be all of itself.
It's not the goal, it's the medium.
Absolutely. Snir or Nora, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree. I think one thing on a completely different dimension that has occurred to me, especially as we've been sort of in this distributed remote environment for going on 2.5 years, the loss of the drive-by, or the loss of the, hey, 5 quick minutes, which on the one hand is very interrupt heavy and interrupt painful, but it's actually like in my experience, one of the more effective ways of quickly unblocking somebody, which has multiplicative effects in terms of productivity. That's gone. And there's no 5-minute option in Google Calendar, not to mention the overhead to schedule a 5-minute meeting in Google Calendar would take more than 5 minutes. And so I think we've tried to embrace, this is frankly a little bit new and a little experimental, but like embracing the huddle feature, embracing sort of like synchronous rooms, trying to just figure out how to create that spontaneity and that quick solve has been one of the bigger focus points for me over the course of the last 2.5 years. Still don't have a perfect solution. Sorry, audience. Don't have the penicillin there, but it's definitely something that's top of mind for me.
I would really plus one that. We've been using Huddle a lot recently too, which is great because I felt like for a while we were kind of hesitant to interrupt someone unless we had a meeting on the calendar, but it kind of inhibited this like creative flow of work that you do have when you're in person. And I liked the Huddle because you can kind of quickly jump in, it's opt in or opt out, and other people in your Slack can also see that you're doing this. And so it's a nice, I think, little ad hoc mechanism that's almost akin to passing someone in the hallway or seeing them at the coffee machine or stopping at their desk that we don't really have remote. I think one of the hardest things is like, we kind of accept that the pandemic and remote life is our truth right now. And so we can't address any of the things that make it hard. But I actually think, when we're doing incident reviews or postmortems, calling out what about that made some of this hard is actually going to be really useful, like vocalizing it and talking about it as a group. It's not like you can end remote work or end the pandemic, but you can at least talk about what aspects of that made this project hard or made this thing hard, and opening up that conversation, I think, allows for better solutions to get addressed. But I feel like a lot of time we're dancing around this elephant in the room that we think this can't be resolved, so we might as well not bring it up. Yeah.
So, okay, this has been great. And I want to make sure that we have time to answer some of the really good questions that some of our audience members have submitted. But before we do that, I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to kind of get their last thoughts out on what we've been talking about so far. So quick lightning round question is, any final thoughts that you want to leave our audience with from today's conversation? And Snir, we'll start with you.
Ooh, I get the hot seat first. I would say, I guess repetition makes the prayer or something. Like, I think that the point about aggregations and using those to identify elbows in the curve, to identify sort of change over time where things are sort of breaking down, especially as a company scales, as the team scales, as the culture rotates over time. I think that's thing number one. And then, maybe uncreatively, I think sort of encouraging team members to even do a time audit on sort of a regular cadence, not something crazy, but once every 6 months or so. Take the last week, really be thoughtful about where the time went, where sort of there was the most loss, is another great input into establishing organizational flaws or technical flaws. Again, we talked about deploy processes, et cetera. But yeah, maybe those are the two things that I would leave folks with.
Great. And Nora? I think you're on mute.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay.
We can.
Yeah, challenges of remote world, right?
That was a good demonstration of the challenges of the remote world.
Exactly. That was part of this. It was intentional. No, but I think the thing I would add the most on today is just really, really trying to understand how people collaborate and communicate without trying to change it first. Just understanding how exactly work gets done and pulling out the areas that are working the best and knowing when to execute them and when to not. I really like Uma's communication norms, and with fast growing startups or fast growing companies, those need to constantly be revisited too. And so just being diligent about some of those things and recognizing that the culture is not just within you as a leader, but instilling everyone and empowering everyone to enact it too.
Absolutely. And then Uma, final thoughts.
So I think for me, it's really kind of taking a step back from like the how to why do we care about all of this, and kind of going back to what you opened with. Usually we care because it's what keeps our teams happy, but it's also why we all exist, in the sense that all of us work at relatively small companies, and so to survive, it's actually essential to be productive and to consistently ship with high quality. So kind of, just a reminder that all of this is in the goal of continuing to ship things, and then everything else sort of is like leading towards that. And so instead of obsessing about the exact metrics, maybe if you kind of want like a quick thing of why should I care about this, maybe like start with, are you happy with the results, and then go back from there, work backwards from that.
Excellent. I feel like this time has absolutely flown by, but we did manage to save about 10 minutes for Q&A. So one of the questions from the audience, from Aiden, thank you. How much does the act of estimating work and or measuring the delta between estimate and actual time spent actually impact the bottom line on productivity? Does this become more important with larger teams? I feel I'm like looking like, who might have an answer for this first? Just jump right on in.
I can maybe take a stab at it, though I might have like a clarifying follow-up question. So maybe I'll start with my understanding of the question, which is does the process of measuring actually also add to the entire like effort? That's my understanding. I say I agree with that, but I think it's sort of I think at any point it's actually sort of becomes pretty critical, and it sort of becomes like you can either know for sure or you can just sort of have this cost not be measured, and there will be an ongoing thing. The reason I think it is important to do regardless of the cost is because if you don't do it, then you don't know where to make the right investment. So it's, to me, it's a little similar to kind of a framing that I would make is, why should you talk to your users if you're building a product? Like, does that take too much time? Right? So it's like, absolutely it takes time, but if you don't talk to your users, you're building the wrong thing. So if you don't talk to your developers about productivity, then you don't know how to make it better for them.
Yeah, and one thing this question is like a little meta in some ways, if we can still use that word like ever. Like, I just have the story that I used to tell my students of back in the day, where our engineering team, like the person in charge, made us do an 8-hour retrospective on why why we were not getting things done, like why our burn down charts where they were not going to be, and then that time was not taken into account into any of the calculations for that week, and it was just like, oh, no, we're spending all the time figuring out where the time went. Oh my goodness.
See, that's just like the way they even formulated that meeting is so not psychologically safe. You're going to end up spending that entire meeting finger pointing and playing the blame game, and maybe even in subtle ways. But like, I think it's still useful to retrospect how things happened, and like framing it like that, like looking at it as an opportunity, like even just those subtle language changes can open up a whole different conversation for folks. But I'm so sorry that happened to you. That's horrible. And I think what Uma said too is like, yes, this is necessary. Like, your time estimates as engineers, like, yeah, you're going to get them wrong, but also that impacts everyone else in the organization and impacts your entire business, as does marketing's time estimates, as does any individual group's time estimates. And so I think it's imperative to study if you're getting them right or not, and how wrong they are, and not shaming people, but understanding, like, if you're studying that delta, you can then apply it towards the next cycle and understand how to get better, and understand what impacted it and what was outside of our control, and why certain things made sense at the time.
I was going to say estimations as a stick is a mistake, and I think that very much goes to that point. I think estimations, and again, one thing to embrace is that engineering has a lot of both known and unknown unknowns as you traverse a project, and so that naturally creates a skew in sort of estimation hit rate, let's call it. That being said, I do think that there is sort of like a burn down that you can take toward estimations. Okay, so we're bad at estimating a year out project. Are we bad at estimating a month out project? Are we bad at estimating a week out project? Are we estimating a day out project? At certain points, the analysis there, and I think this is very much maybe to the previous point, Nora, that illuminates something, which is, oh, well, I didn't account for the 3 interviews that showed up, in that one day, right? And that can be really informative. But I do think, I don't want to just dismiss, and again, I think very consistently with everything that's been said, I don't think throwing estimations out the window and saying like, oh, let's not look at that. That doesn't inform whether or not we're productive or not. Like,
it gets done when it gets done.
Right. That's too laissez-faire. And again, that will mitigate impact. That will mitigate landing artifacts.
Snir, I really love that point on like, are we good at the week long? Are we good at the month long? And I would also add to it, like, how, like Uma's point earlier, how quickly are you ramping up new employees? Like, how many new employees were we able to throw on a project and estimate correctly? Because if you have the same team all the time, you can get really good at estimations. But the thing is, our system is constantly changing. People are going, people are coming, people are getting hired. And so your estimates are going to need completely new frames of thinking each time you make them, because your system and your team are different. And so understanding that as a leader and taking that into account, I think is also really helpful as well.
And I want to throw out, there's another question in the Q&A that I think is like relevant to what we were just saying. And this is Zoe is asking, what are some of the changes you've made to your interview process based on the feedback about interruptions? And how do you balance the kind of candidate experience with developer time? Which I'm like, oh my goodness, I feel like you could have a job just focusing on this and how to optimize it.
I will take a controversial approach, which is I actually think interviewing is one of the more important things that we do, right? Investing in the team is critical, and it's actually a form of scale. There's a great book called An Elegant Puzzle that actually maps organizational structure to systems, right? Engineering systems. And it's a form of scale. It's a form of redundancy. It's a form of basically like horizontal scaling, ideally, not literally. And so I actually think interviewing is really important. Now, my caveat there is that there is diminishing returns. I mean, Google's run tons of studies that are very informative and very interesting. And the point is how can you burn down time to hire, right, in a way that still gives the team and the candidate a great indication that this is the team they want to join and this is the candidate the team would like to bring in. And so that's where we spend our time, which is doing a little bit of analysis on sort of conditional assertion of an incremental loop. So this is actually a real example. We used to run 2 phone screens at Retool, and we discovered that one of them was actually not very informative against ultimate decisions. And so we're in the process of relaxing that one. And so those types of projects, or you know what, we have 3 leak code problems, and that's not a great assessment of how people really work. And so we're going to change that process in a way that is maybe more asynchronous. Maybe it's a project and requires less strain on the team, but also gives the candidate a real chance to showcase their skill set. So I think it's in the sort of nooks and crannies that the real magic happens here, as opposed to saying like interviewing, that's bad, let's not have engineers do that, because I think that's so one-sidedly off. So that's my 2 cents there.
I think strong
And
one.
bearing oh, go ahead, Emma.
Oh, okay, sorry. Strong +1. Interviewing is really, really important and is absolutely like a huge thing. And I think maybe a sort of like knit with the question, I actually think candidate experience and developer time are actually not in contradiction with each other, because the ideal candidate experience would be the right amount of time spent to get the right signal, to Snir's point, like without too many different like steps. And that actually directly correlates with developer time, because the fewer steps that give you the best signal will then reduce the total time you take interviewing candidates. So they're actually very directly correlated.
And not, spending time just kind of taking the surface level, like if the reaction to, oh, people are in too many interviews is to put more leaders on the interviews or put other people on the interviews, you're actually going to end up with more interrupts and more context switching, because you're not going to end up hiring the right people. And so like enrolling everyone in the process and making it feel productive and making folks feel enrolled in it, and like that's just what's going to be huge, because ultimately hiring the wrong people is just a major impact on productivity down the line that could have kind of been mitigated with restructuring your interviews a little bit differently. I think one of the things that we were paying a lot of attention to were, especially as we were building like our initial engineering team, were questions we had wished we had asked, and learning about that. And I think really incorporating those into our process, retroing the interview process itself, like what signals were we not able to get and how could we possibly get them.
Yeah, this has been great. And I actually paid attention to time, which is my job to do. And we are at about time. Apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. So many great questions. Thank you all for joining us today in our conversation on engineering productivity. And thank you especially to all of our speakers for your expertise and just like real kind of like honest takes on how you see the world.
Thank you all.
Thanks for a great conversation.
Thanks so much, y'all.